During the last few years, an increasing number of scholars have developed a desire to find out more about the Shroud. But Dr. John Robinson, Dean of Trinity College, Cambridge, was perhaps the last one would expect to take a deep interest. His books, particularly Honest to God, have earned him a reputation of being very much a skeptic.
Well, my interest in the Shroud is primarily as a New Testament scholar, and I must confess that when I first investigated it, I was as skeptical of this relic as of any other, all of which, as far as I know, have been shown to be bogus. But the more one went into it, the more one realized there was so much about this thing that a forger would never really have thought of, and indeed that he would come up, I think, with a very different cloth than the one we now have, because he would have started from the evidence of the New Testament as interpreted by Christian tradition, and he would probably have envisaged the body of Jesus as having been wound round in a winding cloth, rather like an Egyptian mummy, with possibly a face cloth over the front, on which he would then have forged an image rather like the bogus St. Veronica's handkerchief. In fact, what we have fits extraordinarily well with the New Testament evidence, and from my point of view helps to make a great deal more sense of it than I saw before.
Hi, my name is Paula Gloria, and my show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. On this show, we study consciousness and how we can create our reality by better understanding who we are, the nature of our thoughts, and the nature of the reality around us that we have and the reality around us that we'd like to have. It's all about developing our awareness and our ability to comprehend new realities. One of my all-time favorite topics is the Shroud of Turin. I look upon this as a document of our extraordinary possibilities. And today I have with me an expert in this field. Dr. J.J. Hurtak is a double PhD in science, and he's going to be able to elucidate this film that I've used as a roll-in on past shows, so that we can see if we can get a glimpse using science and using our critical ability to understand an article that before has been considered only one of faith. So welcome, JJ, to this show.
Thank you, Paula. It's
Yes.
a great privilege to be here with you and to discuss this very important document.
Well, you have a very important life as, you know, can you just give a brief...
Right. I have a background in social science and also a background in remote sensing technology, which is the use of radar, lasers, and other technical tools.
Before you had this spiritual transformation?
Right.
You were...
Back in the early 70s, I had the opportunity to work as a consultant. I interacted with those at Jet Propulsion Lab in Los Angeles that did the Viking studies, the Mariner 9 studies, and I had the opportunity to publish some of my work.
Do you think we could start with the roll-in and then...
In 1973, the weave of the Shroud was microscopically examined by a Turin scientific commission, and although no accurate placing could be obtained, it was found to be quite compatible with material woven on looms in the Middle East at the time of Christ. But the biggest surprise and most positive results came from the studies of a Swiss criminologist and botanist, a special investigator for European police forces, and an expert in the study and identification of pollens.
It is amazing that every flowering plant produces pollen of its own, which can be distinguished from any other pollen. I often employed the study of the microscopical dust in the garments of a suspect, on weapons, tools, or any other piece of evidence in order to find out where these objects had come from. As pollen grains have a very resistant outer wall, the so-called exine, so that they remain unchanged for thousands of years.
Dr. Fry was given an opportunity to study the Shroud at first hand when, in 1973, he was asked to authenticate photographs of the cloth taken a few years earlier.
I remarked between the threads some dust particles, some of them looking like pollen grains or spores. At higher magnification, I was certain of it, and so I asked the competent authorities if it would be possible to take dust samples. I hoped by this examination to find out some details about the history of the shroud. Let me show you what I found. This here, for example, is from the beech, Fagus sylvatica, a plant growing in Central Europe and the northern parts of Europe. And here I have a pollen of Taxus baccata, the yew tree, a plant that is growing too in Northern Europe and Central Europe.
Altogether, Max Fry identified 12 pollens of European origin.
They only confirm what we already know, that the shroud was exposed to the open air in France and Italy. But then I came across this one. Linum mucronatum, and this one, Roemeria hybrida, Glaucium grandiflorum, Onosma giganteum, Astragalus.
Pollens and fibers from 9 species of plants growing exclusively in this area were found on the shroud, indicating that Lire in France was not where it originated.
The presence of such a significant number of pollens from plants growing in Turkey leads me to one fundamental conclusion. At some time of its history, the shroud must have been exposed to the air in southern Turkey or the surroundings of Istanbul.
During the Dark Ages, when Rome had been overrun by barbarians, Constantinople remained unconquered, the capital of Eastern Christianity. Its emperors built up a priceless collection of Christian relics, and from here, in 1203, one French crusader had written that he had seen the Sidwan in which our Lord was wrapped. Was this Sidwan and the shroud one and the same? This was one of the questions that historian Ian Wilson set out to answer.
I began to consider the simple fact that the likeness of Christ that has come down to us through the centuries was surprisingly similar to the image visible on the shroud. Of course, this could mean that the forger, whoever he was, simply chose to copy the conventional likeness. But what if the shroud were genuine? I began to trace the likeness of Christ back through the centuries. The 15th century, the 14th century, the 13th century. Right back, in fact, as far as the 6th century, the likeness to the shroud image was quite unmistakable. But before this time, there was a surprising inconsistency. Many portraits, the Gospels give no indication of how Christ looked, so artists had no model to follow. I wondered What was it that had brought about this sudden, dramatic, definitive likeness in Christ's portraits from the 6th century on? Could it have been the Shroud? I found it intriguing that according to Eastern Christian tradition, this likeness was taken from the image on a strange and mysterious cloth found in the early 6th century, precisely where Max Fry showed the Turin Shroud had once been, in southern Turkey.
The cloth was discovered here in the southern Turkish town of Edessa, now known as Urfa, or perhaps we should say rediscovered. Edessa was the earliest, and at that time, one of the greatest eastern centers of Christianity. Cave tombs in the surrounding hillside were inhabited by thousands of hermits who came just to be close to the holy city. The citizens proudly claimed that Christianity in Edessa dated back to the very time of Jesus himself. They told the story of King Abgar V, who we know ruled in Edessa at the time of Christ. Now Abgar was stricken with a disease. Hearing of the miracles of Jesus, he wrote to him asking that he might come to Edessa and cure him. But Jesus did not come. In his place came a disciple named Addai, bearing with him a cloth, having a miraculous image of the Savior himself. Abgar was cured, and believing on Jesus, he brought Christianity to his city.
Ready with the roll-ins in the studio? We'll start with roll-in number 1. And this will give us
A woven
an
tapestry
idea
is brought out,
of this
carried
important
as if being taken from a tomb. This tradition goes back more than 1,000 years. Each tapestry is different, yet each one bears the image of Jesus laid out on a burial cloth, the body banked with flowers. The similarity to the Shroud is unmistakable. Many say that this tradition of placing flowers around an image of Jesus in his shroud goes back.
That was a short little roll in there, but I guess they're working on the sound. So
Well, it's a very important touch-in to the historical film documentaries that were done on this, and also looking at the piece of cloth that Cardinal Ballastar allowed the NASA scientists and those of the U.S. Air Force Academy, Doctors Jackson and Jumper, to work with. The problem is that part of the cloth that was selected for the scientific studies was perhaps the most handled part, since it was on the edge of the cloth. And recent studies, and this is important for our discussion, those who work with the cloth covering Egyptian mummies have known that there is a coating of a carbohydrate material from 180 to 600 nanometers that covers the cloth that could distort the time factor in this. And so
for the carbon dating.
Yes, all of the carbon dating now has to be re-examined. I'm speaking now of 2006.
Okay.
Researchers are taking a look at the studies that have been done by Walter McCrone and others.
Just a second, let me slow you down because you're a scientist, to get the audience up to speed. People said that the Shroud of Turin was not authentic because the carbon dating showed that it wasn't so old. But on this roll-in that I use, the very man who invented carbon dating said, in essence, as a layman, is how I understood it, that they were carbon dating the mold that was on the fibers. So until such a time was developed where they could eliminate the mold, they can't really get an accurate read. But you may have more recent information.
Right. I was simply stating that the work of the Stirp Group, Walter McCrone and others, that were published, that was published in 3 scientific journals, has now been discounted by the work of Dr. Harry Gove, G-O-V-E, from the University of Rochester, and others, who believe that we must look at the biomaterial on the surface of the cloth.
Right.
And also,
For the first time, Wilson had produced a chain of historical evidence which carried the Shroud back to the one time and the one place it had to have been if it were genuinely the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And that chain of evidence was considerably strengthened when Max Fry finally completed his identification of all the pollens in his sample.
The pollen grains which confirm the presence of the Shroud in Turkey were not all I had found. I had isolated many other specimens which I couldn't identify by the help of botanical textbooks. So I had to travel personally to such countries where the shroud might have been. It was quite natural to go first to Jerusalem and the surrounding wilderness of Judah. Here I found the answer. This plant is Sueda. In this particular variety, it is known only in Palestine. I found pollen from it on the shroud. And this here is Paganum harmala, a desert plant that is very frequent between Jericho and the Dead Sea. I found pollen from this plant too on the shroud.
Altogether, 8 of the species present on the shroud came from this area.
The presence of pollen from such plants growing exclusively in the land of the Bible and the surrounding deserts permits only one conclusion, that in some time of its history, the shroud was exposed to the open air in Palestine.
Yes, I would like to make a little commentary on the Roland because I knew some of the
Yes,
researchers at the so-called STURP, S-T-U-R-P group for the Holy Shroud Scientific Study Group back in the late 1970s that took a critical examination of one part of the cloth. And remember, John's Gospel, chapter 20, speaks about the bandages and also the cloth that was placed over the face of Jesus.
There's biblical reference.
And the biblical reference is important because the distinction is made that this was a cloth, syndona or synology is a study of the shroud of the cloth that absorbed the sweat, absorbed what we will call the energies from the body itself during that dramatic moment.
The blood and the sweat.
With the resurrection event.
Right, the blood and the sweat first.
Yes.
So that the shroud has that on it, and then later on the image, like one of the scientists said, I don't know if we're going to see that on the roll-in, but just for the viewers, one scientist said he fully expected to go over to Italy, to Turin, to come up to the shroud, use his scientific instruments, find the image, that there was paint or whatever, and go home. And at the end, they really couldn't figure it out. But should we start with the roll-ins?
Let's do that.
Okay. Are we ready?
It's difficult enough to believe that a medieval forgery could stand up so well to the kind of investigation we've seen already. But there is yet another characteristic of the image that only the most recent technology has been capable of detecting. Here, at the U.S. Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs, a professor of physics and a professor of engineering have coordinated an intensive research program into the nature of the image on the shroud. Dr. Eric Jumper and Dr. John Jackson.
As a scientist, when I became interested in the computer pictures sent back from the Mariner spacecraft near Mars, I thought that perhaps some of this technology could be applied to the shroud. So then when I was in Albuquerque, I started a rather modest attempt at this, and at that time I met Eric Jumper.
Well, the meeting that John refers to is about 3.5 years ago, and since that time we've made many interesting discoveries about the shroud. Right now we'd like to show you what we feel is one of the most interesting, and it involves the use of this machine. And we'd like to tell you exactly how it works. We already have 2 filters of different density lined up under the television camera that you see here. The television signal is then fed into our equipment, and you can see the filters displayed on our TV monitor.
And of course what you see are 2 squares of different shades of darkness. The television signal is processed by a VP8 image analyzer, which has the ability to translate the image patterns as adjustable levels of vertical relief on this monitor. Now watch what happens as I raise the relief. As you can see, the image intensity patterns are plotted as vertical relief in proportion to the amount of darkness that you see over here. I can also rotate the image and view it from various angles.
Now, before we put a picture of the shroud under the camera, let me show you something. I have here an ordinary photograph of myself in mess dress, one which I'm sure my mother would be very proud of. And I'm going to put this under the camera. Now, John is adjusting the gain in exactly the same way as he did with the squares. I'm sure you'll agree that even my mother would have trouble recognizing me there. Now, the reason for this is very simple. A normal photograph records only variations in light and does not record information about the distance the camera was from the subject. Now we'll put a picture of the shroud under the camera.
As you can see, unlike the photograph of Eric, this image is clearly recognizable. This can only be explained if the intensity levels of the shroud image itself are encoded with distance information from the cloth to the body.
Now looking at is an image of the full body. We have an image of the front and one of the back. Of course, these are the burn marks, but what we're really interested in is the image between them. We see the head, the pectorals of the chest, the two arms, and the legs with one knee slightly raised. What's interesting is that the knee is not raised well above the chest or the head, but looks like it's in the correct dimensions. We see that the back also has the same characteristics, and we can even see a bit of roundedness in the calf.
When I first saw this image, I think I knew how Secunda Pia must have felt when, in 1898, he saw his photographic image. As scientists, we believe that it would be practically impossible for a forger, much less a medieval one, to have produced an image like this.
In 1970s, so this has been like 30, 40 years of studying?
We're looking at something that's moving close to the 30-year mark. The first studies, of course, were done from the front view.
Right.
Other studies showed the three-dimensionality of the image coming out of the cloth.
How did the image get onto the cloth? Much of the research into this has been done in the USA, and Dr. Robinson visited Colorado to discuss the subject with Dr. Jackson, Dr. Jumper, and also Dr. Donald Lynn, supervisor of image enhancement at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, who began by summarizing the situation surrounding accurate scientific dating of the cloth.
The original carbon-14 dating technique required a significant amount of material to make an accurate measurement. In fact, to get the accuracy we'd like, it would require a significant portion of the shroud. But there are techniques under development now that can give an accuracy of the order of plus or minus 50 years with a few square centimeters of material.
The obvious first thought, I suppose, must be that it was by human hand, by some kind of painting. What do you say to that?
Well, if it was a painting, the artist would have had to use some sort of a pigment. The most likely pigment would have been an organic one.
You mean derived from plants or animals?
Exactly. Now, I think we can rule out an organic pigment. We know the cloth was exposed to a fire, and from the damage we can tell that it probably went through a very large variation in temperature, and this would have been reflected in a change in the coloration of the organic pigment. So I think we can rule that one out, because we don't see that. And I think Don also did some work on the art.
Yeah, as part of our work, we did a frequency analysis on the image of the face. And the results of this analysis indicated that there was no directionality to the image.
You mean something like brush marks?
Yes, if it was done by a human hand, you would expect to have a preferential direction or directions, and not a random orientation as we see in our images.
Well, if it wasn't put on from the outside, could it have come from the body itself by some kind of exudation made from sort of sweat and aloes?
We know from simple experiments, for instance, if I had some blood here and laid a cloth over it, the blood would soak through the cloth. But, of course, we know that the image on the shroud is strictly a surface phenomena.
Not only that, if you tried to lay the cloth over the body and produce the image by pressing it around the body, when you straightened the cloth out, you'd end up with a greatly distorted image, and the image on the shroud is not.
There's this time is used where people of goodwill, if they're saints or not, even politicians, come together and think some good thoughts, consider some progressive understandings. And I keep thinking maybe in America we could do something like this, even though we don't quite have these astrological events where we come together to bring the greatest thinkers. This could be a time when
great interfaith dialogue can take place. And
But most of the interfaith people are progressive, but they don't really consider the power objects. They like to stay away from the miraculous. They think it's something only for devotional, unscientific people. And maybe this could be a bridge, this shroud seen as a document.
I like to think that this conversation is a spark to those in the audience who can take a look at the new documents coming out of Egypt, such as the Pistis Sophia text, which is available through our Academy for Future Science.
And we'll roll those in the credits.
And also other studies that are ongoing by leading scientists throughout the world that are looking at the whole dimension of a whole new physics of consciousness and what it will be like in the 21st century to be part of a much greater story of the Christed awareness, the Christed image upon all of us.
Well, you seem to have scotched the two most obvious hypotheses, so what are we left with?
I've made a preliminary analysis of the shroud image, and I found that the color variation of the body image and the burn marks fall along the same color curve.
So do I gather you're saying they're caused by the same process, a scorch?
Well, I'm simply saying that within the resolution of my analytic technique, I cannot discriminate between the color variation of the body image and the burn image.
In fact, a scorch would answer a few questions for us.